November 1943, North Atlantic, 02:18 hours. The last depth charge detonated far astern. The concussion rolled through the hull with familiar violence, steel flexing, gauges trembling, dust falling from seams. Men braced automatically, boots locked against deck plates, waiting for the next pattern. It did not come. For nearly 40 minutes, the U-boat had endured disciplined attack runs. Sonar pings had struck the hull in steady rhythm. Destroyer screws had circled above like tightening gears. Then nothing. No ping. No propeller churn. No explosion. Just water. Inside the control room, no one moved at first. Silence in submarine warfare is deceptive. When the hunt stops abruptly, it rarely means the hunters have left. The hydrophone operator leaned forward, headphones pressed tight. "Contact lost," he whispered. The commander did not relax. "Confirm." Another long moment passed. Negative screws detected, no active sonar. That should have meant survival. It did not feel like survival. The air inside the boat was already stale from prolonged submerged running. Batteries had been drained by evasive maneuvers, sharp course changes, emergency dives, high-speed bursts intended to disrupt sonar solutions. They had survived the loud part. Now came the quiet. The commander pictured the tactical shift immediately. If the destroyers had switched to passive tracking, they would no longer announce themselves with pings. They would listen instead, waiting for machinery noise, for ballast adjustment, for careless propulsion. Silence above forced silence below. "Silent running," he ordered quietly. Diesel engines had been cut long ago, electric motors now reduced to minimum revolutions, no unnecessary movement, no metal dropped, no whispers beyond necessity. The crew understood the implication. Without sonar pressure forcing immediate maneuver, the U-boat could not risk surfacing. It could not risk increasing speed. It could not risk ventilating compartments. It had to wait. And waiting, underwater, consumes resources. Air grows thin. Battery levels fall. Carbon dioxide accumulates slowly, but relentlessly. The earlier chaos of explosions had provided clarity: react, dive, evade. Now there was only uncertainty. Were the escorts still there? Or had they widened the perimeter, drifting silently beyond detection range? The ocean above felt enormous. And empty. Which made it worse. The hydrophone operator strained for any indication: faint screw signature, distant propeller wash. Nothing. The commander checked the clock. 02:37 hours. They had been submerged for hours already. The depth charges had stopped. And that was when the crew began to panic. Because explosions are finite. Silence can last forever. By 03:04 hours, the silence had weight. Inside the U-boat, even small sounds felt dangerous. A wrench slipping in the engine compartment earned a sharp glare. Boots were lifted, not dragged. Voices were reduced to breath-level murmurs. The hydrophone operator sat rigid, headphones sealed over his ears. "Nothing," he repeated for the third time. The commander did not interpret that as reassurance. He interpreted it as strategy. Above the surface, two Allied destroyer escorts maintained slow, deliberate course. Their captains had agreed on the shift. Active sonar was driving the submarine deeper, but it was also alerting it to exact positions. The explosions forced reaction, but reaction consumes energy. Now they would conserve theirs and drain the submarine. Engines reduced to low revolutions, no active pings, no depth charges, just quiet listening. Passive tracking. The destroyers spread slightly, not far enough to lose the estimated contact area, but wide enough to create overlapping acoustic zones. If the submarine increased speed to escape, its propeller cavitation would carry cleanly through the Atlantic water. If it attempted to rise, ballast noise would register. If it tried to recharge batteries at periscope depth, radar-equipped patrol aircraft would be notified. The trap required patience. Back below, battery gauges crept downward. Evasive maneuvers earlier had cost more charge than planned. Electric motors, though reduced now, continued steady draw. The air inside the hull had turned warm and metallic. Sweat gathered under wool collars despite the cold sea outside. At 03:28 hours, a young crewman whispered what others were thinking. "What if they've gone?" The commander didn't answer immediately, because the worst outcome was assuming they had. Surfacing too early meant immediate detection, searchlights, gunfire, depth charges at point-blank range. Remaining submerged meant suffocation risk if the silence continued too long. This was the inversion of normal submarine warfare. Noise had been survivable. Silence was strategic. The hydrophone operator finally raised a hand slightly. Possible distant screw, uncertain bearing. The commander froze. How distant? Far, very faint. Which meant nothing conclusive. The destroyers above were likely drifting at slow speed, engines throttled to reduce signature. Listening, waiting for the submarine to blink first. By 03:52 hours, CO2 levels were climbing, not critical, but trending upward. The boat could remain submerged safely for several more hours. Several. Not indefinitely. The earlier explosions had been physical pressure. This was psychological compression. The crew began to understand what the silence meant. The enemy no longer needed to force them upward. They would surface on their own. And the moment they did, the ocean would stop being silent again. By 04:21 hours, the air inside the submarine had changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Breathing required slightly more effort. Conversation shortened not just because of discipline, but because speaking felt wasteful. Condensation gathered along steel ribs overhead. The faint acidic trace from battery compartments lingered beneath diesel residue. Battery indicators showed steady decline. The earlier high-speed evasive turns had consumed reserve margin. Now the electric motors ran at minimal revolutions, but minimal is not zero. The submarine still had to maintain depth, compensate for currents, adjust trim carefully. Every correction cost power. The commander reviewed options methodically. Remain submerged until absolute necessity. Attempt slow lateral movement to test destroyer perimeter. Or ascend cautiously to periscope depth and risk radar detection. None were safe. The hydrophone operator finally confirmed something more distinct. Distant screws, intermittent, very slow. The commander understood immediately. The destroyers were there. Not chasing. Not circling aggressively. Drifting. Listening. Above, on the bridge of one Allied escort, the captain watched the dark Atlantic horizon. No active sonar pulsed from his ship. No depth charges rolled. He did not need noise. He had position from the last confirmed contact and an understanding of submarine endurance limits. A submerged boat cannot remain invisible forever. Its crew breathes. Its batteries drain. Patience was the weapon now. Back inside the U-boat, tension shifted from fear of explosion to fear of decision. At 04:39 hours, one petty officer approached the commander quietly. Air quality declining faster than expected. CO2 scrubbers were working, but extended submergence increases accumulation inevitably. Another hour would be tolerable. 2 hours uncertain. Beyond that, performance would degrade. The commander checked his watch. Dawn was approaching. Surfacing at first light carried different risks than surfacing in darkness. Aircraft patrol probability increased rapidly after sunrise. Radar-equipped planes covered this Atlantic corridor frequently in late 1943. Waiting for full daylight could be worse. But surfacing in darkness while destroyers listened nearby could be fatal. The hydrophone operator spoke again. Bearing shift, slight increase in screw speed. Not charging, just repositioning. They were adjusting to anticipated submarine drift, which meant they were confident. Confidence above translated into compression below. By 05:02 hours, fatigue showed in small ways. A sailor leaned too heavily against a bulkhead. Another blinked slowly over gauge readings. The air was not yet toxic. But it was no longer comfortable. The depth charges had stopped. The violence had ended. Yet the real battle had begun afterward. Because now the enemy controlled time. And underwater, time is oxygen. By 05:18 hours, the air inside the U-boat had thickened enough that men were no longer pretending not to notice. Breaths came slightly deeper, movements were slower. A sheen of sweat-covered faces despite the cold Atlantic water pressing against the hull. Battery levels were approaching the lower margin where propulsion would become unreliable. Electric motors could continue at minimal revolutions, but not indefinitely. The commander gathered his officers quietly in the control room. Options were reviewed without drama. Remain submerged another hour, risking degraded crew performance and possible system failure. Attempt deeper dive, risk structural strain and increased battery drain. Or surface deliberately on their own terms before desperation forced it. The hydrophone operator removed one ear cup slightly. Destroyers still present, slow speed, no active sonar. They had not left. They were waiting. Above, the Allied escort captains maintained their slow drift. One ship held slightly north of the last known contact point, the other offset to the southwest, forming a loose acoustic barrier. They had calculated average submerged endurance for a U-boat under sustained evasion. They knew battery consumption curves. They knew air recycling limits. They did not need to guess. They needed to be patient. At 05:31 hours, the U-boat commander made the decision. We surface before full daylight. The logic was simple: act before weakness becomes visible. Surface while crew still capable of rapid dive if necessary. It was not confidence. It was necessity. Compressed air hissed softly as ballast adjustments were prepared. Engines remained silent. The ascent would be gradual, controlled, to minimize surface disturbance. Inside the hull, men secured loose equipment. Anti-aircraft crews positioned themselves below hatch, ready to emerge instantly. No one spoke about what might be waiting above. Because everyone understood. The depth charges had stopped hours ago. But that had not been mercy. It had been calculation. At 05:44 hours, the submarine began its ascent. Water pressure eased incrementally. The hull creaked as depth reduced. The hydrophone operator listened one final time. Both destroyers increasing speed. The commander closed his eyes briefly. They had been waiting for this exact sound. Above the Atlantic surface, dawn's first pale line touched the horizon. The ocean still looked empty. Calm. Silent. But silence was never absence. It was preparation. As the U-boat's conning tower neared the surface, the destroyers adjusted course with measured precision, not racing wildly, not firing blindly. They did not need to. The submarine had just revealed itself by choosing air over depth. And sometimes, the most decisive moment in a battle is not an explosion, But the instant someone is forced to breathe. At 05:47 hours, the U-boat broke the surface. Cold Atlantic air rushed down the open hatch as the conning tower cleared the water. For a split second, the ocean looked empty, grey, calm, stretching to a pale horizon. Then the lookout saw it. Destroyer, port quarter. The Allied escort had not charged recklessly during the night. It had drifted within intercept distance, engines idling low, listening. Now, as soon as the submarine's hull displaced surface water, the destroyer increased speed. Not dramatically, just enough. The second escort appeared moments later off the starboard bearing, slightly farther out, but closing on converging course. The trap had not required explosions. It required patience. On the U-boat, diesel engines roared to life as the commander ordered emergency dive readiness. Anti-aircraft crews climbed from the hatch instinctively, scanning sky for aircraft that had not yet arrived. There were no planes. There didn't need to be. The destroyers opened fire with deck guns, not heavy broadsides, but precise ranging shots meant to suppress and damage the conning tower before the submarine could fully submerge again. Water columns erupted dangerously close. The U-boat attempted crash dive procedure, but ballast tanks were slow to flood after prolonged silent running. Reaction time underwater is not immediate. Above, the escorts coordinated wordlessly. One maintained gunfire pressure, the other adjusted position to cut off escape vector. The submarine had surfaced before dawn to preserve air and power. The destroyers had predicted the window. The battle that followed was brief. Not chaotic, not cinematic, just controlled force applied at the moment of exposure. The silence had ended, and it had ended exactly when the escorts expected it to. By 06:02 hours, the U-boat situation was untenable. Damage from surface gunfire had compromised upper structures. One crewman lay wounded near the conning tower ladder. Flooding reports began filtering from forward compartments, minor but growing. Attempting to dive again under direct observation would mean descending damaged, slow, and still within sonar envelope. The commander faced a final calculation. Remain surfaced and fight briefly, or scuttle and abandon. He understood what the destroyer captains had engineered. They had not needed to destroy him underwater. They had needed to deny him choice. When the depth charges stopped hours earlier, the U-boat crew believed the danger might have passed. In reality, the danger had simply changed form. Silence had compressed them. Air had forced them upward. And the moment they surfaced, the escorts had been exactly where they needed to be. At 06:11 hours, the order was given. Abandon boat. Scuttling charges were set quickly. Crew members climbed onto the pitching deck as cold wind cut through exhausted bodies. The destroyers closed cautiously, guns still trained but no longer firing. No final explosion marked the decisive moment. The submarine slipped beneath the Atlantic, not under a barrage of depth charges, but because it ran out of air and time. The escorts had ended the engagement without sustained bombardment. Patience had replaced violence. Listening had replaced pursuit. The ocean had gone silent, and that silence had been the most dangerous weapon of all. Late 1943 marked a turning point in the Atlantic War. Allied technology had matured, radar improved, direction finding tightened, escort coordination became disciplined and methodical. But one of the most effective changes was psychological. Instead of forcing submarines to react to noise, escorts began exploiting endurance limits. A submerged submarine cannot remain underwater indefinitely. It must surface for air, for battery recharge, for survival. By switching from active attack to passive listening, Allied escorts inverted the dynamic. They removed pressure, and in doing so, created a deeper one. The U-boat crew panicked, not when explosions shook the hull, but when the explosions stopped, because silence meant the enemy was confident enough to wait. The battle ended without a final underwater detonation. It ended because oxygen ran low, because batteries drained, because time cannot be evaded. The ocean did not roar in victory. It simply stayed quiet long enough. And sometimes in modern war, the most decisive weapon is not firepower, but patience measured in hours beneath the surface. When the sea goes silent, someone is listening.